the basics of who we are and what our nature is are pointed out, and that is pretty straightforward. And one of the things that we've talked about, and I always like to impress, is the total simplicity and availability of what that is. A lot of us at some stage assume that this must be very complicated, or we're talking about some incredibly tricky experience or some rare experience. And so what happens is that when we get down and start talking about this and looking at what this non-dual perspective is pointing to, that gets pointed out, and it really is as simple as what you are, and everybody recognizes the fact of their being, their very presence itself. And all we're really doing with this is we're pointing to that and say, take a look at that, be clear on what that is, and see it for yourself. And the entire experience of what that is here now. And it's not difficult to see that, and it's not the complexity of it that was the trouble. It actually turns out to be the complete total simplicity and the fact that it's already present that has caused us to overlook that. So what we're doing in the beginning is we're just simply highlighting and pointing back to the basic truth of who we are. So what you see, though, is the mind often will step in and begin raising a series of questions. And what I would stress is that, and how I look at this when I'm dealing with those questions, is the actual specific content of the questions itself is not as relevant as we think. So I like to kind of step back and look at the fact, just the general activity of what the mind is doing in those situations. So essentially what you have is you have this pointer to this obvious and simple and clear, doubtless reality of our true being. And what we're going to find is that gets pointed out in the beginning. That is what this is all about. And at the end of the day, it's nothing more than that. But in the interim, often what you see is the mind, out of its old habits, it will say, but what about this and what about that? And want to raise all of these questions and doubts. And so what I like to look at with that is just understand generically at a very high level what the mind is actually doing. It's posing all of these what ifs and buts and issues and caveats and all this kind of thing. And at that stage, there's this idea that those are relevant somehow, that those are meaningful, that those somehow contradict the basic point of it all. And there's a phase in there where we may be fascinated and interested and involved in those questions and doubts. And they can be, there can be endless numbers of questions and doubts. And like I say, I'm not really so much interested in dealing with and analyzing the actual content of the questions, but more understanding, seeing the mechanism of what's going on. So you have the mind stepping in and essentially trying to contradict or compare, analyze, come up with all these side issues that want to draw the attention, want to draw our interest and attention into these questions. And what we're going to find eventually is that whole game is a complete dead end. That the questions do not enhance the basic experience of who we are. The questions do not contradict the truth of what's being pointed out. And we eventually have to learn that lesson, which is turning to the mind, expecting the mind to understand and know who we are, and expecting these questions and things to lead us to clarity is, at a very global level, is basically a dead end.
Yeah, sure.
And the easiest, the simplest way this was pointed out to me, and I eventually did hear it this way, is The answer is not in the mind. And so that's one of the pointers. The other one is, the mind cannot grasp or understand or recognize what's being pointed to.
Welcome to podcast number 8 with John Wheeler, who has graciously once again agreed to deal with some of the common questions that people have once they're exposed to the expressions of non-duality. And one of the ones that I hear quite a lot is, okay, I've done this investigation, I've looked into this, I've seen my true nature, you pointed it out beautifully, thank you, but I still feel this anger and frustration when things don't go my way. And especially, when I'm around other people who seem to trigger stuff that's latent in me, and, I get upset and frustrated. When I'm by myself in my home, it's clear and there's no suffering, but I get triggered out in the world by other people. And I feel anger and frustration that, it seems like it was done and then suddenly it seems like it's not done.
Yeah, how would I look at that actually? From my perspective, the basic this thing about in the world and other people and whether I'm at home or not. I mean, basically, based on what we've looked at, that way of framing the question is a little bit showing a misunderstanding.
Mm-hmm.
Because suffering is an internal, subjective experience in our own relationship with the mind. In other words, the only thing that causes suffering is our own ideas and concepts about who we are. And, I mean, I kind of stand on that one as a bedrock, a very foundational point with this. The senses perceiving a world around us has never been the cause of suffering. Whether we're in a home, outside the home, whether really is not what causes us to suffer. And I mean, not to deny that subjectively it may feel that way, or that's the way it's being experienced and how the mind's interpreting it. But that's the one thing that I might stress, just to be very, very clear on that. We don't want to have this idea that, to fall back into this idea that the external world, that's what's causing the problem. So the premise being that these self-identifications in the mind, this looking for our identity in these concepts of who we are, that's always the bedrock of where the limitation comes in.
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's key that's very clear.
That identity, identifying oneself as that idea or thought, I or me.
Yeah, and so what we might see is that you might find that, in certain environments it creates certain associations, and it might trigger, some of the self-identities, some of the concepts, some of the beliefs that we have. Okay, granted,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not. We still want to be very clear and understand what is actually going on there. Suffering is self-centered thinking and taking that as true, period.
Mm-hmm.
That's what suffering is. Suffering is not what other people do or what the world is doing or what state the body-mind is in or anything like that. Suffering is when these ideas about who I am, the mind presents them, and there's a doubt or a kind of a wavering on that such that I think this might be who I am. Maybe this is true. Maybe this is the reality of what I am. And so that identification with those limited concepts is that always gets back to what the root of the trouble is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is, as we've talked about, and I think your experience would show that there is a resolution of that. There is an actual resolution of that mechanism, that way of the mind playing out, and that potential to identify with the mind. There is a way of looking at this and understanding who we are such that there is a stepping free of that.
Mm-hmm.
And if that is not our experience, then it means that the understanding or the recognition or looking and seeing that needs to go a little deeper. It needs to be a little more thorough and a little more comprehensive. That's my basic advice on it.
Yeah, very good. So
you can't just say, I've seen this, I know who I am, and then, oh, by the way, the suffering and the doubts are all coming back in, and I guess it didn't work.
All right.
It's just showing kind of in a way that a little more looking needs to happen, a little deeper understanding of the mechanics of this really needs to take place.
From my perspective, what I saw is that the moment I think I know this stuff, that's really kind of begins to be a bit of a trap if I think I know that I understand. I remember hearing once somebody talking about how that what made it click for him was when he took the I out of the understanding. That seeing that there was an understanding, certainly a direct and immediate understanding, but that there was no I that had owned that understanding. And
yeah, well, I think what the way you pose that, it makes it sound like I've seen this. I thought that I had the understanding, when I was at home and, a certain situation was a certain way, it seemed like it was all clear. But now I find that, that the understanding is eluding me, and then kind of because of certain circumstantial situations. And it's just, I mean, in all honesty, and just all direct looking, it's just a not fully, really grasping, the essence of what is being communicated.
We're still buying into some interpretation delivered up by the mind, right?
Yeah, and you can take these pointers and these kinds of teachings, and it can become just another, some mental understanding to try to, claim it. I've got it. And then it becomes just another position, like another identity. Like, I'm somebody who looked at non-duality, and I got the understanding, and I'm done, or something like that. And that means I should have a such and such a payoff. And then there's kind of like the mind just wanting to kind of grasp a hold of that, and then say, look at me, like, look at me, I understand. And the experience proves that to be very fragile and not a very clear or comprehensive way of looking at what's being pointed to.
Right. In my own case, I know that happened kind of as an almost trying to prop up the sense of identity to not get down where the getting close to the seeing through that identity was kind of feeling vulnerable and insecure, and because there was nothing left to really hang on to as me. So that was very potent to begin to see, well, maybe what there is really nothing there, and if there's nothing there, then who am I? And that's scary.
Yeah, and it's really just a call. It's really just a call of looking and making sure that what is being pointed out is truly seen, and not just asserted, as some kind of conclusion or some understanding that I think that I have. But if we're suffering or we're finding ourselves getting kind of caught up in the conceptualizing and all that, there's only really a basic, question there, and that is to really go back and look and make sure that we understand. First of all, and as always, who are we? What is our true nature? And then, do we really understand what is generating the suffering? Have we really seen the nature of the suffering and what's driving it? And really follow the basic points. And that's, there's nothing, you can't really escape that. You can't really escape this somehow that not looking at that. The basic premise of this thing is, basically, your true nature, your innate being is free of suffering, is problem-free, and is not a divided, limited entity at all. And there's nothing in heaven and earth that can change that. And it's due to a misunderstanding and a misidentification with a conceptual image of who we are, that is the root of all of the questions and doubts and suffering. So, it shouldn't be like, mysterious about what's going on. It's not because I suddenly walk out of my house and I'm interacting with people that suddenly becomes the root cause of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So we just, I would just say any of these kinds of things are a call to go back and revisit the basic points.
Excellent. Right. That's a pretty good segue. Here's another. You mentioned the notion that there's going to be some payoff if I get this for me, which, certainly was a trap that I found myself in along the way. The notion of some payoff, of some special state, some special way of being that was extraordinary or unique. And at the heart of that, really, for the identity called Charlie was, okay, well, I want to be special. I want to be superior and special and have special powers and so on and so forth. And one of the questions that comes along quite often is that it's kind of like, I've been told that when the self is realized, that one is awake even during sleep, and that there's a witnessing of sleep. There's awareness or a wakefulness even in deep sleep. And this is not how it is for me. So, does this mean that I'm not seeing correctly? That's a fairly common one, actually, in this spiritual lore of witnessing sleep.
Yeah, I hear that. Things like that, it kind of falls into a category of, we've read different pointers, and there are many pointers out there. All kinds of different points have been made, and we come across these things, and we read them, and we hear about them, and then the mind basically steps in and says, well, I don't understand this, or this isn't my experience, and okay, does that mean therefore that I don't, have the understanding, or that I'm missing something, or it just becomes a way the mind kind of comes into the picture and becomes an excuse, from a conceptual level to tell us why we're somehow not complete, that we're somehow missing something. And it's just the old thing about following the mind again, really. You don't need to, in all of that discussion, in all of those theoretical kinds of things, the present being, or that conscious nature that you are, there's no doubt about that. Like right now, you can't say I am not, and you can't deny the nature of what you are. So even, those kinds of questions, they just move us away from the immediacy of direct experience of what is present and beyond doubt into these conceptual mental what-ifs that are completely hypothetical. And, I like to tell people, or ask them, when you're in deep sleep, do you have any questions or problems? And they don't.
Exactly.
So just leave well enough alone. When you're in deep sleep, you're at peace. So the question is just completely artificial and has very little relevance to practical, understanding of this stuff. You're present. Yeah.
Yeah. What I've responded, I'd like to get your take on it as well. Is that sometimes the way I respond is, well, do you have some picture or some rule of, something you're trying to attain for you still, called witnessing sleep? And who is it that would attain such a thing?
Well, I often like to go back, to kind of as a touchstone, go back to something like a young child and really ask yourself, would they be troubled? Are they troubled by such questions? And all of this tricky Vedanta stuff and deep sleep and all these, incredibly complex things that, that the religions and paths have come up with, they're just so conceptual in the sense that they're so specific to very, deep, kind of, philosophical discussions that some culture had or something like that. And they really are very, in my view, they're not particularly important. They're not that meaningful.
They're really a distraction, aren't they?
They come back to the immediacy of now. You know, what relevance do they have to recognizing the fact of your being in this moment?
Mm-hmm. None
And
whatsoever.
they have no meaning.
Yeah, none whatsoever.
So again, that's why we hammered on this in some of the early talks. But the basics, the basics, the basics,
Mm-hmm.
the pointer to your being and your ever-present, doubtless nature, and just being clear on that without any confusion is the point of this. And the way that we do that is to see what is. And we do not have to go to deep sleep or do theoretical concepts or philosophical positions. All of those things, in fact, move us away from the immediacy of the essence of what's being pointed out. So, I mean, again, just you could have a general response to that is, what does that have to do with this fact of being that's here right now?
Right.
I mean, if that's clear, and there is a confidence in knowing the truth of your being, and you're curious about some of these things, I mean, they can be raised and you can look at them, but when we overlook the obvious truth of what we are, and then the mind is interposed and we begin to think that the resolution of these questions is somehow related to this truth of who we are, that's the rub. I actually don't engage in those questions at that stage. I do not like to answer those things and talk about those things when such a basic, kind of misunderstanding is obviously in play. I think I need to figure out all these things in order to recognize my being.
Yeah.
So let's reset on that one first. Let's reset on that and realize that you don't.
Yeah.
And make sure that what you are is clear. And then, okay, well, if if we want to look at that, but what I actually find is that usually what happens is that the drive or the interest to look at those questions actually just kind of evaporates.
Mm-hmm.
Like, who cares about deep sleep or after death or what Buddha said about this or that? Who really cares about that when the truth of who you are is clear and beyond any doubt? That problem-free state is your direct experience. Do we really care to go back into the mind and work all these things out? And what would be the benefit?
Yeah.
Because, even if you answered the question, we may have talked about this, I don't know if we did, but it's an interesting point, is that to think about what happens when you answer a question. Well, a couple of things can happen. Either another question comes up, and then you're off into another to another. Or, if you actually answer the question, it just drops away.
Mm-hmm.
And is no longer being thought about. So, the end game, I mean, the payoff of answering a question is the question drops away.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens when the question drops away? Where are you?
Right here.
You're right here where you started.
Yeah.
So there's that some of those old pointers, where they said you're sitting under a shade tree, you go out in the hot sun, you get overheated, you come back, you go out, you come back, you go out, you come back, and pretty soon you just say, well, why am I leaving the shade?
Yeah.
So I actually feel that analogy works virtually for every question. Like, all of these questions, they do not lead to the recognition of the essence of what needs to be seen. They're diverting, into a conceptual level.
Mm-hmm.
Where this ever-present being, this non-conceptual reality that is the endpoint, so to speak, I mean, it's basically what this is all about, is here effortlessly in plain view with no need to go to the mind to recognize that. In fact, you can't even use the mind to recognize the simplicity of who you are.
Mm-hmm. That's how many times have we heard and said, and you have said, the mind is the wrong tool for the job.
Yeah, nobody uses their mind to recognize the fact of their being. Well, there's a comprehensive way to look at all of these questions and doubts, and that is the old pointer, but basic, very valuable one. The answer is not in the mind.
Mm-hmm.
The mind is not what is used to recognize reality. That's just the basic truth of it.
Yes.
So if you can see and appreciate at a global level that why turning to the mind or following the doubts does not lead to peace or clarity, and just really get that at a gut level that the answer that we're looking for is not in the mind, then it just saves you from even having to deal with that level. You know, these thoughts will come up, they'll pass away, they'll come up, they'll pass away. But there isn't a necessary reason that we have to jump on board and follow each and every thought that arises.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it will no longer have any juice. It won't be compelling anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason actually is the mind is trying to tell us who we are.
The mind is trying to tell us who we are. That's a beautiful pointer.
Yeah, so to see that what's going on in all of this activity is still the age-old, issue of the nature trying to tell us who we are. And just realizing that that mind is incapable of doing that. So, like, the suffering is just turning to the mind, expecting it to answer the question, who am I? That's really what suffering is.
Mm.
And the mind is saying, you're this, you're this, you're this, you need this, it's the way it, blah, 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 you have to do all this, you have to do all this. If you can just nail all this down and understand, then you will be okay.
Mm.
But I think we can see now just the futility of that. It's just not the way it works.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, and that's been,
how... Go ahead.
That's been underscored, through all of the podcasts that we've done together. That thread is very evident through them all, and I think when that thread is skipped over and overlooked, that the answer is not in the mind, and that to see that it's just that the mind or the inner conversation is just trying to tell us who we are, and to not listen to that in the most profound sense, to not pay attention to that, but notice what's always present, which is this presence awareness. Yes.
Yeah, and and even just to look more finely at that is to really understand and see why are we so interested in the mind? Because what actually happens, I'm sure that you've seen this, is there's a point in this where that interest is no longer there anymore. You're just not interested in what the mind is telling you about who you are. Because why? Because this idea that we had that our being or identity or our identity is in the mind, that we've seen through that concept.
Right.
So the interest in the mind is because we're still looking for who we are. We're not sure. We're not certain about who we are.
Mm.
So it always gets us back to the real root of suffering is not knowing who I am.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And the mind will step in out of it's not evil, it's not a monster, but the mind will innocently try to answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
And because we are not confident or clear in the truth of who we are, that allows that interest to want to return again and again and again to the mind until we understand and see through that mechanism.
Beautiful. So to understand this, not in the way that the mind normally considers understanding, which would be comprehending something intellectually, because that kind of segues into the other, by far the most common question, which is not really a question, it's more of an assertion or a statement, which is, okay, I've heard the podcast, I've read the books, I understand this intellectually, but it's not my experience. And that's a very, very common one. Yeah, I get it intellectually, or that sometimes it's really couched in quote correct language, unquote. It's advisedly correct. They say, it is seen here that there is no one, but that's not my experience. It's intellectual only. It's comprehended intellectually only. And I hear that one a lot, and it was one of my complaints that I actually talked to both you and Bob about at one point. So if we could address that, I think it might be really helpful for people.
Well, I mean, there's a reality check in this whole thing going on here, and that is, we're not just sitting around armchair philosophizing, throwing out pointers at an intellectual level that people are supposed to memorize or just kind of appreciate. It's a call to verify
Mm.
the truth of the pointers in experience. So, we can't, so that, we just have to reiterate that this is not something to just simply be taken at a conceptual level. Oh, I understand that sounds good. I've heard the words. I can repeat the words and all that. But, I don't experience it. Well, of course we wouldn't experience it until we actually look and check out the truth and apply these pointers.
Mm-hmm.
And because if you actually look at what is being pointed to, not just think about the words that you've heard, but basically look and see what actually is being pointed to, that is very necessary. I mean, it's without that, all of this is, it has no applicability. Like, you can talk about something all day long, but if there's no doing, there's no application, then yes, it's not going to be effective.
Beautiful.
So, so I would just say, well, let's go ahead and actually look and actually see for ourselves and apply it experientially.
And verify it. I think that's a very important point, that unless it's verified in our own direct experience, non-conceptual, if there's such a thing, non-conceptual experience, that without that, then it's all just philosophy and stuff, and it's of no real value in terms of ending suffering.
Yeah, because and it actually, if like when we were doing the podcast and going from the basics of looking at who you are and all that stuff. I mean, the truth of it is those things need to be looked at, while that's being communicated, to see that if that you make sure that you see and you understand what's being pointed to. If you listen to hours and hours of podcasts, but you've never verified or actually seen in your experience what's being pointed to, it just becomes almost useless.
Exactly.
In fact, it becomes worse than useless, because you're just accumulating all these concepts. It's going into your head, in, just filling it up, and yet there's no looking happening.
Mm-hmm.
There's no verification. There's no checking anything. And I would rather say it would be much more beneficial, and we talked about this a little bit, would be to take a single point there and see what you can see in your direct experience. Can you see what's being pointed to? Does that match your experience? What do you see about it? Like I often talk about the fact of your being, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And do we see what's being pointed to there? Do we understand what that means? Can I recognize that fact of my being as a reality in my direct experience? Not just somebody talking about being, but do I actually recognize my being? Can I see that fact in my experience?
Yeah, and can you deny that you are?
Exactly. And I guess what this comes up for me to say is this is not a path, so to speak, for intellectuals.
Right.
This is not for scholars and intellectuals and people that want to conceptualize and just sit around thinking about philosophical concepts.
So we come back really to kind of not that. It's not philosophy. It's not religion. It's not spirituality. It's not anything.
Yeah. It's really a non-conceptual. I mean, it's realizing through one way or another we come to realize the importance of this message, and there are many different reasons why it could be important. I mean, you brought up this idea of suffering and all that stuff, and that may drive us to a point where we realize that we're very interested in the resolution of that suffering or that seeking or those problems.
Well, I might mention here, you and I have both shared some experiences like this, but I might just share here that recently I found out that there was some chance that I might have cancer. And when I was told that I might have cancer, there was very, very interesting the direct practical value of what's being shared here really came to the forefront, because there was no sense that there was no sense of fear, there was no sense of frustration or anger. Oh, I'm going to die. None of that was there. It was just, oh, well, that's interesting, and okay, well, if I do, I do, and if I don't, I don't. And the only request I have of you, doctor, is manage the pain for me.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, it's, well, so what? I mean, it really was so what, and it wasn't that that there's a not caring about being alive and all of that sort of nihilistic stuff, but it's more like there's just a freedom from any sense that there's something wrong about any of that. Heck, a body has to disintegrate somehow. As good a way as any.
Yeah, can you see, I mean, just based on, what we've talked about, what is it that's kind of deactivated that suffering? What's the real change that is allowing that to be seen without it being taken on board as suffering?
It's an absolutely clear and obvious seeing that the identity has no real existence. It's almost like this self-image, self-concept that I had of me is no longer taken to be who I am.
Yeah, because normally, until we look at this stuff, we probably have thoughts like, I have the cancer.
Exactly.
Or this is happening to me, or what will happen to me. And there's ways in which that identity, if it's still active, that I thought is being attached to all of these things, like the body is me, the prognosis is me, the potential thing that I'm imagining about the outcome, that relates to my identity. So you can see how the mind might take news like that, and it would begin to construct a conceptual picture, and that would all be related to that I thought.
Yeah.
And then I would be actually identified as that thought and feeling like my being or my very existence itself is what is being affected by these concepts. And I think what you're saying is that identity with that core notion that would own all of those concepts is no longer something that is taken on board anymore.
Exactly right. And that the interesting thing about it is that that whatever the future there is that I quote live into, it's a future of happiness and peace of mind, regardless of the circumstances. Exactly. Totally irrespective of any circumstance, whatever the circumstances, however wonderful or horrible it may appear to be, doesn't really have the hook anymore. And so, as far as the cancer goes, if anyone's listening who's now all concerned about that, well, don't be, because I'm certainly not. And the other thing is that we really don't know, and it may not be an issue at all. But it was a wonderful gift to be able to see that no circumstance can actually touch who we really are.
Yeah, and I think you might see too that that this is where, and you might want to speak to this a little bit about the practical value of this understanding.
Totally, because it really makes it worth sharing, because it does have a real and practical in the world value. Mm-hmm. It's being in the world is being in the world free of that kind of. I mean, the real malignancy is not some tumor that spreads. The real malignancy is the identity that latches onto it and takes it to be its own. It's about me, and I am going to die. I mean, there's enormous fear in that I am going to die idea, and that fear is just not there anymore. And man, what a gift that is! Huge practical value.
Yeah, something like that is worth all of the, I mean, we've looked at this together for quite some time, and whatever energy that we've put into the spirit you're talking about now is worth all of that. I mean, it makes it all worthwhile.
Absolutely.
And the thing was, this is not philosophy. It's not some scholastic endeavor. It's not just some intellectual head trip. It's not just something to bandy away the hours on the internet. That's not what this is. This is about freedom. It's about lived experience of being free from suffering, from doubt, from seeking, from personal worry, as a reality moment by moment, not just once for a fleeting moment due to some experience, but by getting to the root and really, really dealing with that root, such that, and as you're telling me in your direct experience, seeing that there is nothing in the environment, good or bad, up or down, that can change this recognition. You know?
Exactly. Yeah, nothing can alter
Yeah.
the fact of my being.
Yeah, and the circumstances certainly don't. And that goes back to when we're verifying these points. Like I often tell people, look at your experience right now, see the thoughts, and ask yourself and look to see if your being is changing at all.
Mm-hmm.
See, that's why I like to and actually ask people to stop at that moment and see the answer to that, verify it, test it, and come out yes or no.
To verify it, I think this to underscore that it's the verification that actually creates the possibility for that kind of happiness and peace of mind.
Yeah, yeah. And you're telling me very clearly, based on your experience, that you know through your own direct experience that the circumstances that occur cannot alter the fact of that being. You know that.
Exactly.
Because why? Not because I've told you that or you read that in some book. Because you have looked and you know beyond any doubt that that's a certain fact.
And anyone can verify this for themselves. That's the beauty in this, that the simplicity and the beauty is anyone can verify this. Just, have a look where the pointers are pointing.
Yeah, yeah. And, and there's a difference by saying, we could say kind of conceptually, here's some, somebody says, okay, being is changeless. Well, that's an interesting philosophy.
Yeah.
But that's not what this is. It's saying, look at your being and find out for yourself whether or not it's changeless. Because when you look at your being in direct experience now to verify whether it's changeless or not, and then knowing the answer, if they get it intellectually it just means they're taking this stuff on board as concepts. So the invitation is doing that.
Right.
And to look at experience and see for yourself. And, so there's a very big difference between hearing pointers and considering pointers and arguing them kind of intellectually and all that versus using them as triggers or motivators to confirm them in experience. So it's night and day. And one brings no end of suffering, no certainty, no clarity at all, just actually loads the mind up with a bunch of verbiage.
Yeah, exactly. And, the other thing is I can see that, for most of my life I was on the warpath to change the circumstances. So, for example, getting news like that, I might have said, well, I better find a good oncologist, and maybe I'll have to go to this and do that and the other thing. No, none of that was there. It was like, well, there's that to be trying to change circumstances would presuppose that the circumstances is how or that life is circumstantially derived rather than derived from the fact of our true being. So it's kind of like, okay, well, happiness is an inside job.
Yeah, I mean, you can't escape the basics because, we've heard ever since probably, King Solomon or, way back that happiness does not come through the objects of the world.
Right.
And yet, how many of us are really, if we look honestly with ourselves, we're actually still hoping that the happiness will come. If I can get this or if this happens, if this changes, if that could only happen, then I would be happy.
Yeah. I think that the takeaway might be the bottom line is that you must verify this, not just put it in the intellect. Because the intellect is the wrong tool for the job. The intellect is great for philosophical understanding and whatnot, but this is not about that, and this is about verifying. Take the pointers, use them to verify in your own actual experience whether or not your being is ever absent and whether or not circumstances can touch and alter the fact of your being.
Yeah, that sounds like a good encouragement, a good pointer.
Yeah. So again, thank you. And thank you is insufficient, but it's all we got with language. Much appreciated, my friend.
Nice to talk once again, Charlie.
Yeah, how would you want to close? Just one last kind of thing. What I'd like you to take away from this, maybe something like that.
I think what we've seen in talking in the conversation today is that the importance of actually looking in direct experience to see what is being pointed to and verifying whether some of these points are true or not in our direct experience. Because my suggestion or my advice, my sharing to people listening to this is that if we do that, then we will see the truth of what's being pointed to. And that means that the freedom and the end of the suffering and the end of the seeking is possible, is available. Otherwise, I would not be talking about this. That's why. And we're not talking theory. We're not talking philosophy. We're talking about a practical recognition of freedom in this life, in daily life, in the midst of practical circumstances. That is really what it gets down to. So I would encourage folks to really look at it from that perspective.
Spot on. That's beautiful. John, I love you. Thank you.
Yeah, love you too.